Okay, this is going to be a short video about radian measure, and it took me a long time to figure out what a radian measure is. I always struggled with that idea, so let's take a look. We're familiar with degrees, right? Okay, in a circle you have 1 revolution, 0 degrees, all the way to 360 degrees, right? Okay, so let's think about something here. Let's think about a circle, all right? And let's say that my radius is equal to 1, okay? Now, 1 revolution around the circle is 360 degrees, right? Let's say this. Let's find the circumference of the circle using 2 times your radius times pi. Okay, if your radius is 1, then your circumference is going to be a length of 2 times pi, which is approximately 6.28. Okay, 3.14 times 2. All right. So now here's what I've got. You have this column of degrees. Okay, and we could also think about a radian measure, which is an arc length. Okay, so instead of using degrees, we can use an arc length. If we do 1 revolution around, the arc length is 2 pi. Okay, so what I know is this. If I take 360 degrees, my radian measure is 2 pi radians. These mean the same thing. It's another way to show an angle measure, but it's used as an arc length. Now let's say I take 360 and I divide it by 2. Okay? So if I take 360 divided by 2, and I know 360 is equal to 2 pi, and I divide it by 2, that means that 180 degrees is equal to pi radians. Okay? So this length over here, which is, this angle measure would be 180 degrees, is the same thing as pi radians. You take that and you divide it by 2. Divide it by 2. You get 90 degrees. So this 90 degree angle measure here would just be pi over 2 radians. That arc length and 90 degrees mean the same thing. Okay, so 90 degrees is equal to pi over 2 radians. Okay, let's say you cut that in half. All right, so hold on, 90 degrees is equal to pi over 2. Okay, divide that by 2. Dividing a fraction by 2 is the same thing as multiplying it by a half, so that means that 45 degrees is equal to pi over 4 radians. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm kind of going down to the most basic one that we have. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do with this circle. Okay, I'm going to kind of put a axis on it. All right, what I know is that this is pi over 4 radians. Okay, which is similar to 45 degrees. Okay, same idea. All right, if I have 2 pi, if I have 90 degrees here, and I add another pi over 4 radians to it, it's going to give me pi over 2 radians. Okay, which would be the same thing as saying 2 pi over 4 radians. I add another pi over 4 radians over here. Now, if I had 45 degrees to 90, that's going to give me 135 degrees. Okay? That would be 3 pi over 4 radians. Okay? If I had another 45 degrees to this, we're going to get 180 degrees. Okay? Which would give me, we already know is going to be pi radians, but if I add another pi over 4 radians to that, it's going to give me 4 pi over 4, but that simplifies down to pi. Okay, you keep going with this 180 plus 45, what is that, 215? No. Is it 215? No, 225. 225 degrees. Add another pi over 4 radians. It's going to give me 5 pi over 4 radians. Add another 45 degrees. That's going to give me 270. Okay. Add another that's going to be 6 pi over 4 radians, which is really going to be just 3 pi over 2 radians. All right. Go across again. Add another 45. This is going to give me 315 degrees. Okay. Add another pi over 4 radians at 7 pi over 4. Okay. Add another one. Add another 45 degrees. It's going to give me 360 degrees. Add another pi over 4 radians. It's going to give me 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi radians. Remember, it's another way of doing this. It's another way of talking about degrees, but you're using arc lengths around that. You simply think about a circle with radius 1, circumference is 2 pi, and you can divide it evenly. Okay, now this is dividing everything by 2. Okay, we can also do by 30-degree intervals as well. I can talk about that next time. Okay, now let's take a look at radian measure using 30 degrees. On the last one, we did radian measure using 45 degrees. Okay, so radian measure. All right, so let's take a look. Let's draw a circle, and I like to do it on an axis. And let's have the radius be 1. Okay, so again, remember, radian measure is just more of like a measure of arc length. Okay, so if I were to find the circumference of this circle, okay, with my radius 1 using 2 times your radius times pi, then you're going to get 2 times 1 times pi, so your circumference is just going to give me 2 pi. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and just say that if I make 1 revolution around this circle, okay, which is my circumference, I have an arc length of 2 pi. Okay, so what I do is I say, okay, if I take 360 degrees, okay, that's going to equal 2 pi radians. Okay, so we have radians and we have degrees. Okay. All right, and so what I know about that is that if I have 2 pi radians, I'm going to have 360 degrees. Okay, if I take 360 and divide it by 2, as well as take 2 pi and divide it by 2, then that's going to give me 180 is equal to pi radians. Okay, so if I say pi radians, then that's going to give me 180 degrees. All right. So if I come over here and put a point down and say, okay, this is going to give me pi radians, which is 180. Okay, I'm going to do 2 pi over here and call that 360. All right, now the one thing I'm going to do, instead of taking this 180 and dividing it by 2, I'm going to take 180 and I'm going to divide it by 6. Okay, and I'm going to take pi and divide it by 6. Okay, and if I take 180 and divide it by 6, that's going to give me 30 degrees. Okay, which is going to equal pi over 6 radians. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to kind of mark off where I have that point here, which is 30 degrees. Okay, if I were to, draw a line and call it, an angle measure of 30 degrees, it's the same as saying pi over 6 radians. Okay, now if I add another, so now we're going to add 30 degrees the whole time. Okay, so 30 degrees, I'm going to add on to that, and I'm going to have 60 degrees. Okay, so if I add another 30 degrees here, I have to add another pi over 6 radians, which is going to give me 2 pi over 6, okay, which is really just pi over 3 radians. Okay, so we're not going to use 2 pi over 6, we'll use pi over 3. Okay, if I add another 30 degrees, it's going to give me 90. Okay, now what that's going to do is that's going to give me 3 pi over 6 radians. Okay, if I add another pi over 6, So 3 pi over 6, whoops, and that's going to give me pi over 2. Okay, we remember that from the last time, so that one's always going to be pi over 2. All right. If I add another pi over 6 radians, okay, that's going to give me 4 pi over 6 radians, which simplifies down to 2 pi over 3 radians, and that's going to give me 120 degrees. Okay, add another 30 degrees, it's going to get me to 150. All right. And then if I add another pi over 6, it's going to give me 5 pi over 6 radians. All right. Add another 30 degrees, we're going to get 180. We're going to get 6 pi over 6 radians, okay, which we already have as pi. Okay, if I add another 30 degrees here, then this is going to give me 210, okay, degrees. And if I take 6 pi over 6 and add another pi over 6, it's going to give me 7 pi over 6 radians, okay? Add another 30 degrees, all right, we're going to get 240 degrees, which gives me, what is that, 8 pi over 6 radians, which is really just going to give me 4 pi over 3 radians, okay? Add another pi over 6, we're going to get 270, which we know from the previous video is going to be 3 pi over 2 radians, okay? Add another, it's going to give me 300 degrees, okay, which is going to give me, what is that, 9 pi over 6, so 10 pi over 6 radians, which simplifies down to 5 pi over 3. Okay, add another 30 degrees, and we're going to get 330 degrees. Okay, if I add another pi over 6 to that, to this, it's going to give me 11 pi over 6 radians. Okay, so when we do it with 30-degree angles, we are either going to get pi over 6, 6 is our denominator, or 3 is our denominator, depending on what we have. So the key is to to really memorize these: pi over 6, pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 4 pi over 3, 5 pi over 3, and 11 pi over 6. Okay, and so what we'll do is we'll use these measures to actually, find points along this circle in the future. So this is kind of the, the precursor to what I want you to do for Section 7, or Unit 7, Section 3 notes. So make sure you kind of watch this video. I know it's kind of long, but it is important. And, once you kind of understand how we get radian measures, and what it is. Remember, radian measure is really just an arc length that represents an angle measure, okay? So that's the idea. All right, see ya, bye.